When Socrates and his two great disciples composed a system of rational ethics, they were hardly proposing practical legislation for mankind, one by his irony, another by his frank idealism, and the third by his preponderating interest in history and analysis, show clearly enough how little they dared to hope. They were merely writing an eloquent epitaph on their country. They were publishing the principles of what had been its life, gathering piously its broken ideals, and interpreting its momentary achievement. The spirit of liberty and cooperation was already dead. The private citizen, debauched by the largesses and petty quarrels of a city, had become indolent and mean-spirited. He had begun to question the utility of religion, of patriotism, and of justice. Having allowed the organ of the ideal to atrophy in his soul, he could dream of finding some sullen sort of happiness in unreason. He felt that the austere glories of his country, as a Spartan regiment might have preserved them, would not benefit that baser part of him which alone remained. Political virtue seemed a useless tax on his material profit and freedom. The tedium and distrust proper to disintegrated society began to drive him to artificial excitements and superstitions. Democracy had learned to regard as enemies the few in whom public interest was still represented, the few whose nobler temper and traditions still coincided with the general good. These last patriots were gradually banished or exterminated, and with them died the spirit that rational ethics had expressed. Philosophers were no longer suffered to have illusions about the state. Human activity on the public stage had shaken off all allegiance to art or reason. Life is older and more persistent than reason, and the failure of a first experiment in rationality does not deprive mankind of that mental and moral vegetation which they possessed for ages in a wild state before the advent of civilization. They merely revert to their uncivil condition and espouse whatever imaginative ideal comes to hand, by which some semblance of meaning and beauty may be given to existence, without the labor of building this meaning and beauty systematically out of its positive elements. Not to study these imaginative ideals, partial and arbitrary as they are, will be to miss one of the most instructive points of view from which the life of reason may be surveyed, the point of view of its satirist. For moral ideals may follow upon philosophy, just as they may precede it. When they follow, at least so long as they are consciously embraced in view of reason's failure, they have a quite particular value. Aversion to rational ideals does not then come, as the intuitionist's aversion does, from moral incoherence or religious prejudice. It does not come from lack of speculative power. On the contrary, it may come from undue haste in speculation, from a too ready apprehension of the visible march of things. The obvious irrationality of nature as a whole, too painfully brought home to a musing mind, may make it forget or abdicate its own rationality. In a decadent age, the philosopher who surveys the world and sees that the end of it is even as the beginning may not feel that the intervening episode, in which he and everything he values, after all figure, is worth consideration, and he may cry in his contemplative spleen that all is vanity. If you should still confront him with a theory of the ideal, he would not be reduced, like the pre-rational moralists in a similar case, to mere inattention and bluster. If you told him that every art and every activity involves a congruous good, and that the endeavor to realize the ideal in every direction is an effort of which reason necessarily approves, since reason is nothing but the method of that endeavor, he would not need to deny your statements in order to justify himself. He might admit the naturalness, the spontaneity, the ideal sufficiency of your conceptions, but he might add, with the smile of the elder and the sadder man, that he had experience of their futility. Such a position may be turned dialectically by invoking whatever positive hopes or convictions the critic may retain, who, while he lives, cannot be wholly without them. But the position is spacious, and does not collapse, like that of the intuitionist, at the first breath of criticism. Pessimism and all the moralities founded on despair are not pre-rational, but post-rational. They are like the work of men, who more or less explicitly have conceived the life of reason, tried it, at least imaginatively, and found it wanting. These systems are a refuge from an intolerable situation. They are experiments in redemption. As a matter of fact, animal instincts and natural standards of excellence are never eluded in them, for no moral experience has other terms, but the part of the natural ideal which remains active appears in opposition to all the rest, and, by an intelligible illusion, seems to be no part of that natural ideal because, compared with the commoner passions on which it reacts, it represents some simpler or more attenuated hope, the appeal to some very humble or very much chastened satisfaction or to an utter change in the conditions of life. Post-rational morality thus constitutes an intention, if not in fact, a criticism of all experience. It thinks it is not, like pre-rational morality, an arbitrary selection from among coordinate precepts. It is an effort to subordinate all precepts to one that points to some single eventual good, for it occurs to the founders of these systems that by estranging oneself from the world, or resting in the moment's pleasure, or mortifying the passions, or enduring all sufferings in patience, or studying a perfect conformity with all the course of affairs, one may gain an admission to some sort of residual mystical paradise, and this thought, once conceived, is published by revelation and accepted as a panacea. It becomes, in consequence, for such is the force of nature, the foundation of elaborate institutions and elaborate philosophies, into which the contents of worldly life are gradually reintroduced. Socrates was still living when a school of post-rational morality arose among the sophists, which after passing quickly through various phases settled down into Epicureanism, and has remained the source of a certain consolation to mankind, which, if somewhat cheap, is none the less genuine. The pursuit of pleasure may seem simple selfishness, with a tendency to debauchery, and in this case, the pre-rational, instinctive character of the maxim retained will be very obvious. Pleasure, to be sure, is not the direct object of an unspoiled will, but after some experience and discrimination, a man may actually guide himself by a foretaste of pleasures he has found in certain objects and situations. The criticism required to distinguish what pays from what does not pay may not often be carried very far, but it may sometimes be carried to the length of surpassing every natural instinct and natural hope, and of turning the philosopher, as it turned Hegesias the Cyrenaic, into a eulogist of death. The post-rational principle in the system then comes to the fore, and we see clearly that to sit down and reflect upon human life, picking out its pleasant moments and condemning all the rest, is to initiate a course of moral retrenchment. It is to judge what is worth doing, not by innate ambition of the soul, but by experience of incidental feelings, which to a mind without constructive ideas may seem the only objects worthy of pursuit. That life ought to be accompanied by pleasure and exempt from pain is certain, for this means that what is agreeable to the whole process of nature would have become agreeable also to the various partial impulses involved. Another way of describing organic harmony and physical perfection. But such a desirable harmony cannot be defined or obtained by picking out and isolating from the rest those occasions and functions in which it may already have been reached. These partial harmonies may be actual rests or impediments in the whole, which is to be made harmonious, and even when they are innocent or helpful, they cannot serve to determine the form which the general harmony might take on. The organism in which this principle of harmony might find pervasive expression is still potential, and the ideal is something of which, in its concrete form, no man has had experience. It involves a propitious material environment, perfect health, perfect arts, perfect government, a mind enlarged to the knowledge and enjoyment of all its external conditions and internal functions. Such an ideal is lost sight of when a man cultivates his garden plot of private pleasures, leaving it to chance and barbarian fury to govern the state and quicken the world's passions. Even Aristobus, the first most delightful of hedonists, who really enjoyed the pleasures he advocated, and was not afraid of the incidental pains, even Aristippus betrayed the post-rational character of his philosophy by abandoning politics, mocking science, making his peace with all abuses that fostered his comfort, and venting his wit on all ambitions that exceeded his hopes. A great temperament can carry off rough philosophy. Rebellion and license may distinguish honorable souls in an age of polite corruption, and a grain of sincerity is better in moral philosophy than the whole harvest of conventionalities. The violence and shamelessness of Aristippus were corrected by Epicurus, and a balance was found between utter despair and utter irresponsibility. Epicureanism retrenched much. It cut off politics, religion, enterprise, and passion. These things it convicted of vanity, without stopping to distinguish in them what might be inordinate, what might be rational. At the same time, it retained friendship, freedom of soul, and intellectual light. It cultivated unworldliness without superstition, and happiness without illusion. It was tender towards simple and honest things, scornful and bitter only against pretense and usurpation. It thus marked a first halting place in the retreat of reason, the stage where the soul had thrown off only the higher and more entangling part of her burden, and was willing to live, in somewhat reduced circumstances, on the remainder. Such a philosophy expresses well the genuine sentiment of persons, at once mild and emancipated, who find themselves floating on the ebb tide on some civilization, and enjoying its fruits, without any longer representing the forces that brought that civilization about. The same emancipation, without its mildness, appeared in the cynics, whose secret it was to throw off all allegiance and all dependence on circumstance, and to live entirely on inner strength of mind, on pride and inflexible humor. The renunciation was far more sweeping than that of Epicurus, and indeed well nigh complete. Yet the Stoics, and underpinning the cynical self-sufficiency with a system of physics, introduced into the life of the sect a contemplative element which very much enlarged and ennobled its sympathies. Nature became a sacred system, the laws of nature being eulogistically called rational laws, and the necessity of things, because it might be foretold in auguries, being called providence. There was some intellectual confusion in all this, but contemplation, even if somewhat adulterous, has a purifying effect, and the sad and solemn review of the cosmos, to which the Stoic daily invited his soul to make it ready to face its destiny, doubtless liberated it from any unworthy passion. The impressive spectacle of things was used to remind the soul of her special and appropriate function, which was to be rational. This rationality consisted partly in insight to perceive the necessary order of things, and partly in conformity to perceive that this order, whatever it might be, could serve the soul to exercise itself upon, and to face, with equanimity. Despair, in this system, flooded a much larger area of human life. Everything, in fact, was surrendered except the will to endure whatever might come. The concentration was much more marked, since only a formal power of perception and defiance was retained and made the sphere of moral life. This rational power, at least in theory, was one peak that remained visible above the deluge. But in practice, much more was retained. Some distinction was drawn, however unwarrantably, between external calamities and human turpitude, so that absolute conformity and acceptance might not be demanded by the latter, although the chief occasion which a Stoic could find to practice fortitude and recognize the omnipresence of law was in noting the universal corruption of the state and divining its ruin. The obligation to conform to nature, which, strictly speaking, could not be disregarded in any case, was interpreted to signify that everyone should perform the offices conventionally attached to his station. In this way, perfunctory citizenship and humanity were restored to the philosopher, but the restored life was merely histrionic. The Stoic was a recluse, parading the marketplace, and a monk disguised in armor. His interests and faith were centered altogether on his private spiritual condition. He cultivated the society of those persons who, he thought, might teach him some virtue. He tended to the affairs of state so as to exercise his patience. He might even lead an army to battle if he wished to test his endurance and make sure that philosophy had rendered him indifferent to the issue. The strain and artifice of such a discipline, with merely formal goals and no hope on earth or in heaven, could not long maintain itself, and doubtless it existed at a particular juncture only in a few souls. Resignation to the will of God, says Bishop Butler, is the whole of piety. Yet mere resignation would make a sorry religion, and the negation of all morality, unless the will of God was understood to be quite different from his operation in nature. To turn Stoicism into a workable religion, we need to qualify it with some pre-rational maxims. Islam, for instance, which boasts that, in its essence, it is nothing but the primitive and natural religion of mankind, insists in abandoning itself to the will of God, or, in other words, in accepting the inevitable. This will of God is learned for the most part by observing the course of nature and history, and remembering the fate meted out habitually to various sorts of men. Were this all, Islam would be a pure Stoicism, and Hebraic religion, in its ultimate phase, would be simply the eloquence of physics. It would not, in that case, be a moral inspiration at all, except as contemplation and the sense of one's nothingness might occasionally silence the passions, and for a moment bewilder the mind. On recovering from this impression, however, men would find themselves enriched with no self-knowledge, armed with no precepts, and stimulated by no ideal. They would be reduced to enacting their incidental impulses, as the animals are, quite as if they had never perceived that in doing so they were fulfilling a divine decree. Enlightened Muslims, accordingly, have often been more Epicurean than Stoical, and if they have felt themselves, not without some reason, superior to Christians in delicacy, in savoir vivre, in kinship with all natural powers, this sense of superiority has been quite rationalistic and purely human. Their religion contributed to it only because it was simpler, freer from superstition, nearer to a clean and pleasant regimen in life. Resignation to the will of God being granted, expression of the will of man might more freely begin. What made Islam, however, a positive and contagious novelty was the assumption that God's will might be incidentally revealed to prophets before the event, so that past experience was not the only source from which its total operation might be gathered. In its opposition to grosser idolatries, Islam might appeal to experience and challenge those who trusted in special deities to justify their worship in face of the facts. The most decisive facts against idolaters, however, were not yet patent, but were destined to burst upon mankind at the last day, and most unpleasantly for the majority. When Muhammad speaks in the name of the universal natural power, he is abundantly scornful toward that fond paganism which consists in imagining distinct patrons for various regions of nature, or for sundry human activities. In turning to such patrons, the pagan regards something purely ideal, or, as the Quran truly observes, worships his own passions. Allah, on the contrary, is overwhelmingly external, and as far as possible from being ideal. He is indeed the giver of all good things, as of all evil, and while his mercies are celebrated on every page of the Quran, these mercies consist in the indulgence he is expected to show to his favorites, and the exceeding reward reserved for them after their earthly trials. All his mercy does not exclude all the senseless and unredeemed cruelties of which nature is daily guilty. Nay, it shines all the more conspicuously by contrast with his essential irresponsibility and wanton wrath, a part of his express purpose being to keep hell full of men and demons. The tendency toward enlightenment which Islam represents, and the limits of that enlightenment may be illustrated by the precept about unclean animals. Allah, we are told, being merciful and gracious, made the world for man's use, with all the animals in it. We may therefore justly slaughter and devour them, insofar as comports with health. But, of course, we may not eat animals that have died a natural death, those offered in sacrifice to false gods, nor swine, for to do so would be an abomination. Unfortunately, religious reformers triumph not so much by their rational insight as by their halting traditional maxims. Muhammad felt the unity of God like a philosopher, but people listened to him because he preached it like a sectary. God, as he often reminds us, did not make the world for a plaything. He made it in order to establish distinctions and separate by man's interval the fate of those who conform to the truth from the fate of those who ignore it. Human life is indeed beset with enough imminent evils to justify this urgent tone in the Semitic moralist, and to lend his precepts a stern, practical ring, absent from merely Platonic idealisms. But the stringency, which is called positivism when the conditions of welfare are understood, becomes fanaticism when they are misrepresented. Had Muhammad spoken only of dynamic unity in things, the omnipresence of destiny, and the actual conditions of success and failure in the world, he would not have been called a prophet, or have had more than a dozen intelligent followers scattered over as many centuries. But the weakness of his intellect and his ignorance of nature made the success of his mission. It is easier to kindle righteous indignation against abuses when, by abating them, we further our personal interests. And Muhammad might have been less zealous in denouncing false gods had his own God been altogether the true one. But, in the heat of his militancy, he descends so far as to speak of God's interests, which the faithful embrace, and of fighting in God's cause. By these notions, so crudely pre-rational, we are allowed to interpret and discount the pantheistic sublimities with which, in most places, we are regaled, and in order that a morality, too weak to be human, may not wither altogether in the fierce light of the Absolute, we are led to humanize the Absolute into a finite force, needing our support against independent enemies, so complete in the bankruptcy of that Stoic morality which thinks to live on the worship of that which is. As extremes are said to meet, so we may say that a radical position is often the point of departure for opposite systems. Pantheism, or religion and morality abdicating in favor of physics, may, in practice, be interpreted in contrary ways. To be in sympathy with the whole may seem to require us to outgrow and discard every part. Yet, on the other hand, there is no obvious reason why being should love its essence in a fashion that involves hating every possible form of being. The worshipper of being accordingly assumes now one, now the other, of two opposite attitudes, according as the society in which he lives is in a pre-rational or a post-rational state of culture. Pantheism is interpreted pre-rationally, as by the early Mohammedans, or by the Hegelians, when people are not yet acquainted, or not yet disgusted, with worldliness. The Absolute then seems to lend a mystical sanction to whatever existences or tendencies happen to be afoot. Morality is reduced to sanctioning reigning conventions or reigning passions on the authority of the universe. Thus the Muslims, by way of serving Allah, could extend their conquests and cultivate the arts and pleasures congenial to a self-sufficing soul, at once indolent and fierce, while the transcendentalists of our times, by way of accepting their part in the divine business, have merely added a certain speculative loftiness to the maxims of some sect or the chauvinism of some nation. To accept everything, however, is not an easy nor a tolerable thing, unless you are naturally well pleased with what falls to your share. However, the Absolute may feel, a moral creature has to hate some forms of being, and if the age has thrust these forms before a man's eyes, and imposed them upon him, not being suffered by his pantheism to blame the Absolute, he will, by an inconsistency, take to blaming himself. It will be his finitude, his inordinate claims, his enormous effrontery, and having any will or any preference in particular, that will seem to him the source of all evil, and the single blot on the infinite lucidity of things. Pantheism, under these circumstances, will issue in a post-rational morality, It will practice asceticism and look for mystical deliverance from infinite existence. Under these circumstances, myth is inevitably reintroduced. Without it, no consolation could be found except in the prospect of death, and, awaiting that, in incidental, natural satisfactions, whereby absorption in the absolute might come to look not only impossible, but distinctly undesirable. To make retreat out of human nature seem a possible vocation, this nature itself must, in man, in some myth, be represented as unnatural. The soul that this life stifles must be said to come from elsewhere, and to be fitted to breathe some element far rarer and finer than this sublunary fog. A curious foothold for such a myth was furnished by the Socratic philosophy. Plato, wafted by his poetic vision too far, perhaps, from the utilitarianism of his master, had eulogized concretions in discourse at the expense of existences, and had even played with cosmological myths meant to express the values of things, by speaking as if these values had brought things into being. The dialectical terms, thus contrasted with natural objects, and pictured as natural powers, furnish the dogmas needed at this juncture by post-rational religion. The spell which dialectic can exercise over an abstracted mind is itself great, and it may grow into a sacred influence and a positive revelation when it offers a sanctuary from a weary life in the world. Out of the play of notions carried on in a prayerful dream, wonderful mysteries can be constructed, to be presently announced to the people and made the core of sacramental injunctions. When the tide of vulgar superstition is at the flood, and every form of quackery is welcome, we need not wonder that a theosophy having so respectable a core, something, indeed, like a true logic misunderstood, should gain many adherents. One of the names of things and of virtues, a mystic ladder, could be constructed by which to leave the things and the virtues themselves behind. But the sagacity and exigencies of the school would not fail to arrange the steps in this progress, the end of which was unattainable except, perhaps, in a momentary ecstasy, so that the obvious duties of men would continue, for the nonce, to be imposed upon them. The chief difference made in morals would be only this, that the positive occasions and sanctions of good conduct would no longer be mentioned with respect, but the imagination would be invited to dwell instead on mystical issues. Neoplatonic morality, through 1,000 learned and vulgar channels, permeated Christianity and entirely transformed it. Original Christianity was, though in another sense, a religion of redemption. The Jews, without dreaming of original sin or of any inherent curse in being infinite, had found themselves often in the sorest material straits. They hoped, like all the primitive peoples, that relief might come by propitiating the deity. They knew that the sins of the fathers were visited upon the children, even to the third and fourth generation. They had accepted this idea of joint responsibility and vicarious atonement, turning, in their unphilosophical way, this law of nature into a principle of justice. Meantime, the failure of all their cherished ambitions had plunged them into a penitential mood. Though, in fact, pious and virtuous to a fault, they still looked for repentance, their own or the world's, to save them. This redemption was to be accomplished in the Hebrew spirit, through long suffering and devotion to the law, with the Hebrew solidarity, by vicarious attribution of merits and demerits within the household of the faith. Such a way of conceiving redemption was far more dramatic, poignant, and individual than the Neoplatonic, and so was far more popular and better fitted to be nucleus for religious devotion. However much, therefore, Christianity may have insisted on renouncing the world, the flesh, and the devil, it always kept in the background this perfectly Jewish and pre-rational craving for a delectable promised land. The journey might be long, and through a desert, but milk and honey were to flow in the oasis beyond. Had renunciation been fundamental, or revulsion from nature complete, there would have been no much trumpeted last judgment, and no material kingdom of heaven. The renunciation was only temporary and partial. The revulsion was only against incidental evils. Despair touched nothing but the present order of the world, though at first it took the extreme form of calling for its immediate destruction. This was a sort of despair and renunciation that lay at the bottom of Christian repentance, while hope in the new order of this world, or of one very like it, lay at the bottom of Christian joy. A temporary sacrifice, there's thought, and a partial mutilation would bring the spirit miraculously into a fresh paradise. The pleasures nature had grudged or punished, grace was to offer as a reward for faith and patience. The earthly life, which was vain as an experience, was to be profitable as a trial. Normal experience, appropriate exercise for the spirit, would thereafter begin. Christianity is thus a system of postponed rationalism, a rationalism intercepted by a supernatural version of the conditions of happiness. Its moral principle is reason, the only moral principle there is. Its motive power is the impulse and natural hope to be and to be happy. Christianity merely renews and reinstates these universal principles after a first disappointment and a first assault of despair, by opening up new vistas of accomplishment, new qualities and measures of success. The Christian field of action being a world of grace, enveloping the world of nature, many transitory reversals of acknowledged values may take place in its code. Poverty, chastity, humility, obedience, self-sacrifice, ignorance, sickness, and dirt may all acquire a religious worth which reason, in its direct application, might scarcely have found in them. Yet these reversed appreciations are merely incidental to a secret rationality, and are justified on the ground that human nature, as now found, is corrupt, needs to be purged and transformed before it can safely manifest its congenital instincts and become again an authoritative criterion of values. In the kingdom of God, men would no longer need to do penance, for life there would be truly natural, and there the soul would be at last in her native sphere. This submerged optimism exists in Christianity, being a heritage from the Jews and those Protestant communities that have rejected the pagan Platonic elements that overlaid it have little difficulty in restoring it to prominence. Not, however, without abandoning the soul of the gospel. For the soul of the gospel, though expressed in the language of messianic hopes, is really post-rational. It was not to marry and be given in marriage, or to sit on thrones, or to unravel metaphysical mysteries, or to enjoy any of the natural delights renounced in this life, that Christ summoned his disciples to abandon all they had, and to follow him. There was surely a deeper peace in his self-surrender. It was not a thing, even among the Jews, to use the worldly promises of their esoteric religion as symbols for inner spiritual revolutions, and the change of heart involved in genuine Christianity was not a fresh exaltation of gaudy hopes, nor a new sort of utilitarian, temporary austerity. It was an emptying of the will in respect to all human desires, so that a perfect charity and contemplative justice, falling, like the Father's gifts, ungrudgingly on the whole creation, might take the place of ambition, petty morality, and earthly desires. It was a renunciation which, at least in Christ himself and his more spiritual disciples, did not spring from disappointed illusion, or lead to other unregenerate illusions even more sure to be dispelled by events. It sprang rather from a native speculative depth, a natural affinity to the divine fecundity, serenity, and sadness of the world. It was the spirit of prayer, the kindliness and insight which a pure soul can fetch from contemplation. This mystical detachment, supervening on the dogged old Jewish optimism, gave Christianity a double aspect, and had some curious consequence in later times. Those who were inwardly convinced, as most religious minds were under the Roman Empire, that all earthly things were vanity, and that they plunged the soul into an abyss of nothingness, if not of torment, could, in view of brighter possibilities in another world, carry their asceticism and their cult of suffering farther than a purely negative system, like the Buddhistic, would have allowed. For a discipline that is looked upon as merely temporary can contradict nature more boldly than one intended to take nature's place. The hope of unimaginable benefits to ensue could drive religion to greater frenzies than it could have fallen into if its object had been merely to silence the will. Christianity persecuted, tortured, and burned. Like a hound, it tracked the very scent of heresy. It kindled wars, and nursed furious hatreds and ambitions. It sanctified, quite like Mohammedanism, extermination and tyranny. All this would have been impossible if, like Buddhism, it had looked only to peace and the liberation of souls. It looked beyond, it dreamt of infinite blisses and crowns it should be crowned with before an electrified universe and an applauding God. These were rival baits to those which the world fishes with, and were snapped at when seen with no less avidity. Man, far from being freed from his natural passions, was plunged into artificial ones, quite as violent and much more disappointing. Buddhism had tried to quiet the sick world with insects. Christianity sought to purge it with fire. Another consequence of combining in the Christian life post-rational with pre-rational motives, a sense of exile and renunciation with hopes of a promised land, was that esoteric piety could choose between two factors, even while it gave a verbal assent to the dogmas that included both. Mystics honored the post-rational motive and despised the pre-rational. Positivists clung to the second and hated the first. To the spiritually minded, whose religion was founded on actual insight and dissolution, the joys of heaven could never be more than a symbol for the intrinsic worth of sanctity. To the worldly, those heavenly joys were nothing but a continuation of the pleasures and excitements of this life, serving to choke any reflections which, in spite of himself, might occasionally visit him about the vanity of human wishes, so that Christianity, even in its orthodox forms, covers various kinds of morality, and its philosophical incoherence betrays itself in disruptive movements, profound schisms, and total alienation on the part of one Christian from the inward faith of another. Trappists or Calvinists may be practicing a heroic and metaphysical self-surrender, while the busybodies of the respective creeds are fostering, in God's name, all their hot and miscellaneous passions. This contradiction, present in the overt morality of Christendom, cannot be avoided, however, by taking refuge again in pure asceticism. There is, let us say, a law of karma, by which merit and demerit, accruing in one incarnation, pass on to the next, and enable the soul to cruise continuously through a series of stages. Thus the world, though called illusory, is not wholly intractable. It provides systematically for an exit out of its illusions. On this rational ordinance of phenomena, which is left standing by an imperfect nihilism, Buddhist morality is built. Rational endeavor remains possible because experience is calculable and fruitful in this one respect, that it dissolves in the presence of goodness and knowledge. Similarly, in Christian ethics, the way of the cross has definite stations and a definite end. However negative this end may be thought to be, the assurance that it may be attained is a remnant of natural hope in the bosom of pessimism. A complete disillusion would have involved the neglect of such an assurance, the denial that it was possible, or, at least, that it was to be realized under specific conditions. That conversion and good works lead to something worth attaining is a new sort of positivistic hope. A complete skepticism would involve a doubt, not only concerning the existence of such a method of salvation, but also, what is more significant, concerning the importance of applying it if it were found. For to assert that salvation is not only possible, but urgently necessary, that every soul is now in an intolerable condition, and should search for an ultimate solution to all its troubles, a restoration to a normal and somehow blessed state. What is this but to assert that the nature of things has a permanent constitution, by conformity with which man may secure his happiness? Moreover, we assert in such a faith that this natural constitution of things is discoverable in a sufficient measure to guide our action to a successful issue. Belief in karma, in prayer, in sacraments, in salvation is a remnant of a natural belief in the possibility of living successfully. The remnant may be small and expressed in fancy. Transmigration or an atonement may be chimerical ideas, yet the mere fact of reliance upon something, the assumption that the world is steady and capable of rational exploitation, even if in a supernatural interest and by semi-magical means, amounts to an essential loyalty to postulates of practical reason and essential adherence to natural morality. The pretension to have reached a point of view from which all impulse may be criticized is accordingly an untenable pretension. It is abandoned in the very systems in which it was to be most thoroughly applied. The instrument of criticism must itself be one impulse surviving the wreck of all the others. The vision of salvation and of the way thither must be one dream among the rest. A single suggestion of experience is thus accepted, while all others denied. And although a certain purification and revision of morality may hence ensue, there is no real penetration to a deeper principle than spontaneous reason, no revelation of a higher end than the best possible happiness. One sporadic growth of human nature may be substituted for its whole luxuriant vegetation. One negative or formal element of happiness may be preferred to the full entelechy of life. We may see the life of reason reduced to traits, made to express itself in a niggardly and fantastic environment, but we have, in principle and essence, the life of reason still, empirical in its basis, and rational in its method, its substance, impulse, and its end, happiness. Post-rational systems accordingly mark no real advance and offer no genuine solution to spiritual enigmas. The saving force each of them invokes is merely some remnant of that natural energy which animates the human animal. Faith in the supernatural is a desperate wager made by man at the lowest ebb of his fortunes. It is, as far as possible from being the source of that normal vitality which, subsequently, if his fortunes mend, he may gradually recover. Under the same religion, with the same posthumous alternatives and mystic harmonies hanging about them, different races, or the same race at different periods, will manifest the most opposite moral characteristics. Belief in 1,000 hells and heavens will not lift the apathetic out of apathy, or hold back the passionate from passion, while a newly planted and ungalled community, in blessed forgetfulness of rewards or punishments, of cosmic needs or celestial sanctions, will know how to live cheerily and virtuously for life's own sake, putting to shame those thin vaticinations. To hope for a second life to be had gratis, merely because this life has lost its savor, or to dream of a different world because nature seems too intricate and unfriendly, is in the end merely to play with words. What keeps supernatural morality in its better forms within the limits of sanity is the fact that it reinstates in practice, under novel associations and for motives ostensibly different, the very natural virtues and hopes which, when seen to be merely natural, it had thrown over with contempt. The new dispensation itself restores the authority of those human ideals which it expresses in a fable. The extent of this moral restoration, the measure in which nature is suffered to bloom in the sanctuary, determines the value of post-rational moralities. They may preside over a good life, personal or communal, when their symbolism, though cumbrous, is not deceptive. When the supernatural machinery brings men back to nature through mystical circumlocutions, and becomes itself a poetic echo of experience and a dramatic impersonation of reason, peculiar accent and emphasis which it will not cease to impose on the obvious lessons of life need not then repel the wisest intelligence. True sages and true civilizations can accordingly flourish under a dispensation nominally supernatural, for that supernaturalism may have become a mere form in which imagination clothes a rational and humane wisdom.